Ethan, a 5-year-old boy, had a near-death experience that took him beyond this world. For a few minutes, he was clinically dead, but when he came back, something was different. He was no longer the same. His gaze was distant. His words were filled with a fear that no child should know. What did he see on the other side? What did he reveal about the future? This isn't just another story about a near-death experience. This is a report that raises a frightening question. Are we facing a real warning? Could a child have received a message about the fate of humanity? What Ethan described after his NDE was a vision of destruction, an apocalyptic scenario that challenges even the most skeptical. But how is this possible? How could a child who had never been exposed to predictions about the end of the world detail something so accurate and terrifying? Doctors tried to explain what happened. Some say it was just delusion, but what if it isn't? What if this experience is something much bigger than we imagine? What really happens when we die? Is there something waiting for us on the other side? And more importantly, has this child really returned with an urgent message for us all? Get ready for a story that could change your view of life after death and the very destiny of humanity. If you've ever wondered what happens after we leave this world, or if you believe that some people come back with answers that no one could ever imagine, this video is for you. Was what this child saw just a dream or a warning we can't ignore? The answer is about to be revealed. Some truths cannot be ignored, and this experience proves it. Leave your like to spread this revelation and reach those who need to hear this warning. Sign up and activate the bell, because here we unveil hidden mysteries, experiences that defy logic, and messages from beyond that can transform your view of life and death. Now get ready, because what this child revealed when he came back from the dead is something no one ever expected to hear. In the heart of a small American town on a day that should have been like any other, something inexplicable happened. Ethan, a boy of just 5 years old, experienced an experience that defies all logic, an event that would leave his family in a state of shock and experts without concrete answers. It was a sunny afternoon when everything changed. During a family outing, Ethan was playing near a lake, running along the shore, smiling like any innocent child would. But in the blink of an eye, that moment of joy turned to despair. His parents could never say exactly how it happened. One moment Ethan was there, laughing and running, and the next there was just silence followed by a frightening sound, the impact of water and the panic that took over the room. He had fallen into the lake. His small body struggled, but within seconds the current dragged him to a deeper area. Desperation took over the family. Screams echoed as everyone ran towards the water. Time seemed to slow down, but for Ethan, everything went dark. The minutes that followed were a mix of chaos and hope. Ethan's father dove into the lake, looking for his son underwater, while other people called for help. When they finally managed to pull him out, his small body was limp, cold. There was no pulse. His pale face and purple lips revealed that something terrible had happened. Paramedics arrived quickly, beginning resuscitation maneuvers, but the seconds seemed endless. With each chest compression, the mother's screams mixed with the desperate prayers of those watching the scene. Time continued to tick by, but for Ethan, something completely different was happening. Outside, doctors were doing everything they could to bring him back. Inside, in what he would later describe with frightening clarity, he was somewhere else. When his heart finally started beating again and his lungs filled with air once again, the room was filled with a mix of relief and confusion. He was alive, but as soon as he opened his eyes, everyone noticed that something was different. His gaze was lost, as if his mind was still wandering somewhere beyond this world. The doctors tried to reassure him, but when Ethan finally spoke, his words gave everyone complete goosebumps. "Everything is burning." The room fell silent. His parents looked at each other, not knowing what to think. One of the paramedics asked what he meant by that, but Ethan didn't respond right away. He just closed his eyes and started crying. The following hours were a whirlwind of questions and uncertainty. Doctors explained that technically, Ethan had been dead for a few minutes, but they were able to revive him in time. For them, the most important thing was that he had survived. But for his family, the concern went beyond the physical. Something was wrong. His son no longer looked like the same boy he had been before that day. He spoke less, was scared, and avoided sleeping. So on the first night after the incident, when his mother came into the room to check if he had finally fallen asleep, she heard whispering, Ethan talked to himself, or at least that's what she thought at first. But as he got closer, he realized he wasn't just mumbling nonsense, he was telling something that shouldn't be on the mind of such a young child. I saw the world end. The mother froze. Her heart raced as she knelt beside the bed, trying to understand what was happening. With a shaking voice, he asked what he meant by that. Ethan slowly turned his face towards her, his eyes filling with tears. I was there, Mum. I saw everything on fire. The sky turned red, and no one could escape. From that moment on, the family's life was never the same. Ethan began to tell details about something he had never heard before. He described scenes of destruction, as if he had witnessed the end of the world. But how? He was just a boy. He never had contact with apocalyptic stories, never watched films that could plant these images in his mind. So where did all this come from? His parents tried to find rational explanations. Perhaps it was a side effect of the lack of oxygen to the brain. Maybe it had just been a dream. But each time Ethan spoke, the details were more intense, more precise, more impossible to just be a figment of his imagination. He described people running in despair, buildings collapsing, a dark and charged sky. He spoke of an intense light that, at one moment, seemed to offer hope, but then faded, leaving only chaos. He mentioned deafening sounds, screams that echoed everywhere. But what scared his parents most was none of that. It was the last thing he said that night. They told me I had to go back, because I needed to warn you. The mother held her breath. What did this mean? Who had said that? Has he been with anyone on the other side? Ethan turned to the side and closed his eyes, as if he didn't want to talk about it anymore. But as the days went by, more pieces of this mystery began to emerge. Little snippets of what he saw kept appearing in his conversations. He mentioned shadowy figures watching everything, described symbols his family had never seen before, talked about a time that was running out. At this point, his parents no longer knew what to believe. Was it a real warning? Was it just a child's mind? Or do near-death experiences really allow some people to see beyond what we can understand? Not everyone is ready to see the truth, but those who feel the connection know it is more than a coincidence. Are near-death experiences warnings or delusions of the mind? Comment, I believe if you feel there is something bigger behind it, or I need more proof if you are still looking for answers. What comes next could change everything. Ethan tossed and turned in bed that night, his pale face illuminated only by the dim light coming through the window. Their eyes were wide, as if they still saw something that no one else could see. His breathing was rapid, ragged, as if he was still trying to escape something invisible. As his mother approached, holding his small hands, he whispered a single sentence that made her blood run cold. I was outside my body, and I saw it all happen. That statement didn't make sense to a 5-year-old. How could he know what an out-of-body experience was? How could I describe something that so many adults, who have had near-death experiences, took years to understand? But Ethan didn't just know. He felt it. He remembered. The moment his heart stopped, everything went silent. The pain disappeared, and for an instant he felt as if he were floating, rising higher and higher. At first it was a feeling of lightness, as if you were letting go of something heavy. He looked down and saw his own motionless body, saw the paramedics trying to revive him, saw his mother crying and his father holding his head in his hands, begging for a miracle. But he was not afraid. At least, not at that moment. There was a strange peace, a feeling that he wasn't alone, that something bigger was waiting for him. He moved further away from what he knew until suddenly everything changed. The peace was replaced by a charged silence, an oppressive emptiness. It was as if the very air around him became dense, heavy, impossible to breathe. And then he saw it. On the horizon, a flash. First, a golden light, which seemed to shine like the sun, but it quickly transformed. The light was swallowed by dark shadows, a deep red that covered everything around it. The ground began to shake beneath him, and a gigantic fissure opened up, swallowing everything in its path. People ran, desperate, but there was nowhere to run. Buildings were crumbling. The sky was covered in black smoke, and the air was filled with the smell of something burning. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like it wasn't a dream. It was real. It was a warning. Ethan heard screams, lots of screaming, but what terrified him most was that he also heard whispers. Whispers that seemed to come from everywhere, and at the same time, nowhere. They said things he didn't understand, words that seemed ancient but carried with a power he couldn't explain. Something was coming. Something was approaching, and he knew instinctively that that meant the end. It was at that moment that he saw figures in the midst of the chaos, shadows that walked among the flames, observing everything. They didn't run. They didn't scream. They just looked. Ethan felt a shiver run through his ethereal body, as he knew that these presences were not human. They did not belong to this world. But then, amidst the despair, another presence emerged. It was a figure shrouded in light, and for a moment, Ethan felt he wasn't alone. He couldn't say who it was, but he felt that that presence wanted to protect him. But even there, surrounded by destruction, a message echoed in his mind. You need to go back. You need to warn them. Before he could ask what that meant, before he could understand what he had just seen, he felt a force pulling him back, tearing him away from that vision. Everything became a blur, and suddenly, he felt a strong impact, as if he were falling from a great height. His breathing came back with a start. The air rushed into his lungs, and he woke up on the hospital gurney, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. Ethan was back, but what he saw on the other side would never leave him again. Over the next few days, he continued to reveal fragments of what he witnessed. His parents tried to ignore it, tried to believe it was just a dream, an effect of the lack of oxygen, but the more he talked, the more impossible it became to deny it. He described places he had never seen, symbols his parents had never heard of. He spoke of a firestorm, of cities reduced to ashes, of a darkness so dense that it swallowed even the light itself. And then came the worst part. Ethan started drawing. His small fingers gripped the pencil tightly as he scribbled disturbing scenes. People running, a sky covered in lightning cutting through the darkness, shadows watching on the horizon, a figure of light trying to reach something. But there was one detail that made his parents hold their breath. On one of the drawings, Ethan wrote a word he had never learned, a word that no one knew how to explain how he knew it, just 4 letters, but they carried an immense weight. End. If this was all just imagination, if it was just a dream, how could a 5-year-old child describe something so accurately? How could I draw symbols that experts would later identify as similar to ancient prophetic scriptures? And, scarier still, how could he say he heard a voice that seemed to come from within him, but at the same time was not his own? The voice that said, "Time is running out." If that's not a warning, then what is? Ethan spent the next few days in a state of confusion and silence. He seemed to be present, but at the same time distant, as if his mind was still stuck on what he had seen on the other side. His parents tried to comfort him, saying that everything had just been a nightmare, an illusion caused by the trauma of almost death. But he knew it wasn't like that. He knew he had seen something real, something that should not be forgotten. One night, as his mother put him to sleep, he held her hand tightly and whispered, in a voice almost unrecognizable for such a small boy, "I need to tell you, Mom. I need to tell you before it's too late." She hesitated. Deep down, a part of her didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know. But the way Ethan looked at her, his eyes wide and filled with an inexplicable urgency, made her nod slowly. "I saw what will happen to the world." Her heart sped up. Ethan took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say what he knew. Then he started counting. He said that the moment he left his body, he felt as if he was being pulled into a space that felt neither heaven nor earth. There was an immense emptiness around him, but he knew he was not alone. He felt that someone was there, a strong and imposing presence, but one that did not cause him fear. It was then that he began to see. First came darkness, a giant shadow that covered everything, as if it was swallowing the sky itself. Then he heard the screams of despair, voices calling for help. The ground started to shake, and suddenly everything was on fire. He saw entire cities crumbling, buildings being swallowed by cracks opening in the earth. The sea was furious, advancing on the land as if it wanted to put out the fire, but it couldn't. It was as if the planet itself was being destroyed by forces no one could control. He tried to get away, tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then he heard the voice. It was a deep, strong voice that resonated in his mind and filled the entire space around him. It was no ordinary voice. It was as if she were inside him, as if she spoke straight to his soul. They don't listen. They continue to ignore the signs. Ethan felt a shiver run through his body, but he couldn't respond. He just stood there, listening. The voice continued. "Time is running out." The choice will be theirs. He tried to ask what that meant, tried to understand what was happening, but before he could say anything, the images came back. He saw people running away, trying to hide, but there was no safe shelter. He saw a red sky, torn by rays that illuminated the destruction. He saw a number shining in the midst of the chaos. 3 figures, which he couldn't forget. 7, 2, 1. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt it was important. That it was a date, a warning, a number that carried a secret that he needed to understand. Then, as if someone had placed their hands on his shoulders, he felt something pulling him back. The scenery began to fade, and he heard the voice one last time. Tell them. Say it before it's too late. Ethan blinked, and suddenly he was back in the hospital, panting, feeling his chest rise and fall rapidly as the doctors celebrated his return to life. But for him, nothing was finished. On the contrary, everything was just beginning. When he finished telling his story, his mother was in shock. She couldn't find words, couldn't even think of an explanation. How could a 5-year-old describe something like that? How could he talk about destruction and prophecies in so much detail? And scarier still, who had spoken to him? Over the next few days, Ethan began to draw more and more. Its pages were full of images of burning cities, of people running, of shadows watching everything from afar. He drew symbols that his parents had never seen before, symbols that would later be identified by an expert as being similar to ancient prophetic scriptures. But what scared his parents most was the repetition of that number. 721. Ethan wrote it everywhere. He whispered in his sleep. It said that this was the number he was shown, and that he needed to understand what it meant before it was too late. Desperate for answers, her parents began searching. They looked for religious references, historical dates, anything that could make sense of it. But nothing seemed to fit completely. Until one night, while looking at ancient texts about prophecies, they found something that made them hold their breath. In some ancient traditions, the number 721 has been associated with an event of great change, something that would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. For some interpretations, it was a code, a warning hidden in scriptures forgotten by time. But for others, it was a countdown. That sent a chill down Ethan's mother's spine. If his son was right, then what he saw was not just a vision, it was a real warning. And time was running out. Ethan started having nightmares. He would wake up screaming, saying that the shadow was approaching, that he would see the same scenes over and over again. He tried to ignore it, tried to forget, but something inside him wouldn't allow it. He felt like he had a mission, but he didn't know how to accomplish it. Then, one night, something happened. Something that made everything even more intense. Ethan was sleeping when he suddenly started speaking in a language no one recognized. His mother entered the room and saw that he had his eyes closed, but his mouth wouldn't stop moving. He spoke quickly, as if he was repeating something he had been told. She tried to wake him up, but he wasn't responding. It was only after long minutes that he finally opened his eyes. He looked at his mother and said in a trembling voice, he said, "I need to warn him. They need to know." What else had he seen? What else did he know but still couldn't express? And most importantly, was he the only one? Or were there other people who also had this vision and tried to warn the world? Some messages don't arrive by chance, and those who feel this connection know there is something bigger behind these signals. Does this number hide a real warning, or is it just a coincidence? Share your perception in the comments. I believe if you see a meaning in it, or I need more answers if you still seek to understand. And stay tuned, because Ethan still has a lot more to reveal. And what comes next might be the most shocking part of this whole story. Ethan's mother could barely sleep. After last night, after hearing her son speak in that unfamiliar language, after seeing him whisper those words that seemed to come from a place she couldn't understand, fear settled in her chest in a way she couldn't ignore. His son was trying to say something. He was trying to warn. But how to believe? How can we accept that a 5-year-old boy could carry knowledge that no child should have? Ethan's father was trying to stay calm, find a rational explanation for all of this. Maybe it was just the trauma. Maybe it was fragmented memories of what he had heard somewhere, and now mixed with his imagination. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple, because Ethan had never been exposed to anything like this. He has never watched apocalyptic films, never had contact with stories about the end of the world, much less with strange languages or ancient symbols. So, where did all this come from? That's when Ethan's mother made a decision. She needed to find help. I needed someone who could explain what was happening. First, they took Ethan to a doctor. The pediatrician examined him, asked basic questions, tested his reflexes and behavior. But physically, Ethan was fine. There were no apparent sequelae from the drowning, no detectable neurological problems. He was, according to the tests, a healthy child. But her mother knew that it went beyond the physical, so they looked for a child psychologist. Perhaps they thought Ethan was processing the trauma in an unusual way. But as the conversation with the psychologist progressed, more doubts arose. Ethan showed no signs of ordinary trauma. He was not afraid of water. He showed no signs of post-traumatic anxiety. On the contrary, he spoke about his experience objectively without hesitation, as if he was completely convinced that everything he saw was real. And then, during one of the sessions, he said something that made the psychologist stop writing and look directly at the parents. "Time is running out." The phrase echoed in the room. The psychologist asked Ethan to explain further, but the boy just looked down, clasping his hands in his lap, as if he was tired of trying to say something that no one could understand. From that moment on, everything changed. Ethan's parents began looking for other ways to understand what was happening. They delved into studies about near-death experiences, read reports of people who had visions of the afterlife, researched cases of children who came back from NDEs with impactful messages, and the more they investigated, the more they realized that Ethan wasn't the only one. There were other accounts, stories of children who came back from the dead talking about future events, describing encounters with entities that seemed to have an urgent message for humanity. Some of these children spoke of ruined cities. Others mentioned numbers that seemed encoded in ancient prophecies. And the scariest thing? In some of these reports, symbols similar to those Ethan drew on his sheets of paper appeared. It was then that they decided to look for experts in near-death experiences. They found a renowned researcher, someone who had spent years studying NDE cases around the world. When they first got in touch, he was skeptical. But when they heard Ethan's story, when they saw the drawings, the numbers, the symbols, he was silent for a long time. Then he asked something that made Ethan's mother shiver. Did he mention any dates? The parents looked at each other. Yes, he mentioned it. 7/21. The researcher took a deep breath and explained that he had heard this number before. I didn't know what it meant exactly, but there were reports of people who had near-death experiences and mentioned similar numbers, as if they were part of a sequence that pointed to something. But for what? Ethan was taken to a session with this researcher. He was kind, careful, asked about your experience without pressuring you, and for the first time, it felt like Ethan was talking to someone who actually wanted to listen. And it was in this session that the boy revealed something new, something he hadn't even told his own parents yet. The voice showed me a clock. The researcher remained motionless. A watch? Ethan nodded. The hands were spinning very quickly, and then they stopped. The researcher leaned forward, his voice now more careful. And where did they stop, Ethan? The boy looked directly at him. In 7, 2, and 1. The silence in the room was absolute. The researcher took out a notebook, made some notes, and then looked at the parents. He seemed hesitant, like he was trying to find the right words. Then finally he said, "This is very similar to other reports I have heard. Some people who have had near-death experiences have described the same thing. A clock that spins fast and then stops. Some of them mentioned numbers but never a clear pattern. But what intrigues me most is that Ethan is too young to create something like this. He would have no way of knowing about these connections. And yet he saw the same thing that adults around the world described. Ethan's parents felt a knot form in their stomachs. What did that mean? What was your son trying to say? It was then that Ethan interrupted the silence. The shadow has not yet arrived, but she is coming. The researcher leaned forward, his expression more serious now. What do you mean by that, Ethan? He swallowed hard. The voice told me that time is not over yet, but it's getting close. The parents began to tremble. The researcher closed the notebook slowly. He knew this type of report. Many people who have had NDEs have come back with messages, with warnings about future events. But what made Ethan's case different was the clarity, the repetition of numbers, and the connection to other reports. In the following days, Ethan's case began to be studied in more depth. The symbols he drew were sent to experts in ancient scriptures and religious codes. Some said they looked like inscriptions found in ancient manuscripts. Others claimed they were just meaningless scribbles. But then, a disturbing detail emerged. One of the images Ethan drew showed a large arc in the sky, with light cutting through the darkness. When the researcher analyzed it more closely, he realized that the structure resembled something very specific, the shape of the Earth seen from space, with an intense flash on the surface. And this image had already been described before, in other NDE accounts, by other people who came back saying they saw the future, and the question that remained was, if Ethan and these other people saw the same thing, are we really close to something that no one is ready to face? What Ethan revealed in that study session seemed like a puzzle too complex to be just a figment of a 5-year-old's mind. The researcher who interviewed him knew this. He had heard similar stories before, but what made this case so frightening was the precision of the details, the repetition of the symbols, and the fact that Ethan was describing something that other individuals around the world also claimed to have seen during their near-death experiences. Upon investigating further, they discovered that adults, completely strangers to each other, reported visions of destruction, of time running out, and of a great event that would change everything. Many of these people experienced NDEs at different times, in different places around the world, but they carried with them frighteningly similar memories. One case in particular caught the attention of Ethan's parents. It was the story of a man named Daniel Freeman, a former American Air Force pilot. Daniel suffered a serious accident during a training flight, and for a few minutes, his heart stopped. During this time, he described floating out of his body, just as Ethan reported. He said he saw the Earth from afar, as if he were observing everything from a point far above the clouds. But suddenly that view changed. He was no longer looking at a peaceful blue planet. What he saw next haunted him for the rest of his life. According to Daniel, the sky began to darken. It was as if a gigantic shadow was covering everything. He saw firestorms, he saw oceans rising and covering entire cities. He spoke over a huge flash, followed by absolute silence. And then, in the midst of this vision, he saw numbers appearing before him. 3 numbers floating in space as if they were part of a code he couldn't decipher. And what were those numbers? 7, 2, 1. The same number Ethan had seen. The same number he scribbled over and over in his drawings. The same number that has appeared in other NDE reports around the world. Researchers who analyzed Daniel Freeman's case tried to find an explanation. Was it just a delusion? A reflection of your military training? But how then could Ethan, such a small boy, have seen exactly the same thing? How could he so accurately describe something that a former pilot, a man with decades of experience and no relation to him, also claimed to have witnessed? But Daniel's story was not the only one. Another disturbing account came from a woman named Abigail Myers, who had a near-death experience following surgical complications. Abigail was a scientist, an extremely skeptical person who never believed in life after death or anything outside the physical world. But when her heart stopped for nearly 6 minutes, everything she knew was thrown into doubt. She said that the moment she lost consciousness, she felt like she was being pulled away to a place where time didn't exist. She described a feeling of peace, but that peace was short-lived. Soon a voice echoed in her mind, telling her that she needed to see what was coming, and then the vision began. Abigail saw cities in ruins. She saw a sky red as blood. She saw people running in despair. But what impressed her most was the sound. A deafening noise, something that seemed to come from the sky itself, as if it were announcing the end of something. And then, she also saw a number. When Abigail woke up, she couldn't process what she had seen. Her scientific mind tried to find a logical explanation, but something inside her told her that it wasn't just an illusion. She spent years researching other similar experiences, looking for people who had seen the same thing. But it wasn't until she found Daniel Freeman's account that she realized she wasn't alone. And then Ethan came, the boy who could never have known these stories. The boy who drew shadows observing the Earth, who spoke of a countdown, who said that there was a voice warning that time was running out. Ethan's parents began to delve even deeper into these reports. They found dozens of other NDE cases in which people reported seeing future events, warnings of a major collapse, cryptic messages that seemed to want to prepare humanity for something inevitable. In one of the studies analyzed by the researcher who interviewed Ethan, there were records of patients who returned from near-death experiences with the same feeling, that they had been sent back because there was still something to be done, something to be warned about. Many of them said they saw a separation happening, as if the world was about to divide into those who were ready and those who were not. Some spoke of a strong light that suddenly went out, as if it were being taken over by a growing darkness. Others mentioned a date, but said they couldn't read it clearly, as if the information was hidden. But Ethan, Daniel, and Abigail saw the numbers clearly. 7, 2, 1. What did this mean? Would it be a date, a code, a hidden reference in ancient prophetic texts? The researcher who accompanied Ethan began to make connections between these reports and ancient scriptures. In some ancient texts, there were mentions of a period of judgment, a time when great events would change the destiny of humanity. Some of these prophecies spoke of signs in the sky, of darkness covering the earth, of time running out. But were these near-death experiences glimpses of that moment? Could it be that these people were somehow accessing something that hadn't happened yet? Ethan continued drawing. He still scribbled the same number, still talked about the clock that went fast and then stopped. He said he felt something was coming, something that no one could see, but that he knew was approaching. Ethan's parents didn't know what else to do. They were afraid. Fear that their son knew something they couldn't understand. Fear that all this wasn't just a coincidence. Afraid that somehow he was right. What if Ethan and all these other people actually saw the future? What if what he was trying to say was a warning no one wanted to hear? Some stories reveal connections that cannot be ignored. Do you believe these near-death experiences are real? Comment, I believe, or I need more answers if you still seek to understand this mystery. Your vision is part of that journey, and get ready because Ethan still has more to reveal. And what he says next could be the final piece to this mystery. If all of these people really saw the same event, if all of these near-death experiences are connected in some way, then we need to ask ourselves, is this just a coincidence, or is there something bigger going on? Ethan, Daniel, Abigail, 3 people of completely different ages, backgrounds, and beliefs. None of them knew each other. None of them had any contact with apocalyptic stories before their experiences. And yet everyone reported the same thing, the same red sky, the same imminent destruction, the same mysterious number, 721. Now imagine how many other people may have seen something similar and never shared it. How many may have felt the same fear, received the same warning, but decided to ignore it or keep it to themselves? How many other stories could be spread out there without us ever making the connection? Are we facing a true warning from beyond? Science tries to explain NDEs as hallucinations generated by a lack of oxygen in the brain, as a defense mechanism of the mind to smooth the transition between life and death. But if that's all there is to it, then how can we explain the details shared by people of different cultures and ages? How can we explain the precision of these visions, the recurrence of the same elements, the way in which some of these premonitions actually seem to unfold over time? There are records of people who experienced NDEs and came back with messages about events that had not yet happened. Some of these predictions, ignored in the past, ended up being confirmed years later. Are we doing the same now? Are we about to ignore yet another warning? And most importantly, if this is all real, what exactly does the number 721 mean? Would it be a date? If so, what will happen that day? A code? A hidden sequence in some ancient prophecy? Something that needs to be deciphered before it's too late? Ethan said the clock he saw was spinning really fast before stopping at 721. Does that mean we're running out of time? That something is approaching that we can no longer avoid? The question that remains is, are we listening to these warnings? Or are we ignoring it, as so many have ignored in the past? Nothing happens by chance. This message came to you for a reason, a call to see something bigger. It could be the voice of God touching your soul, a sign that this story carries special meaning. Did you feel a thrill, a connection? Did something awaken inside you? So this journey is yours too. Some stories have the power to transform our view of life and what lies beyond it. Sign up now, ring the bell, and dive into incredible stories, near-death experiences and revelations that science still can't explain. This journey for answers starts here. Some messages reach those who are ready to see beyond. Is it part of this awakening? Comment, I heard the call and show that this truth has touched you too. Your participation makes this message even more powerful. Leave your like so that more people have access to this knowledge and continue this journey of transformation. Now move on and delve even deeper into this search for the unknown. Some truths are hidden where we least expect them, and those who have already come this far feel that there is much more to be revealed. The next video is now on your screen. Click now and get ready for something that could change everything you believe.